For 33 years, one small boy's face watched America from milk cartons, missing child flyers, and the hearts of strangers who never knew his name. 6-year-old Etan Patz vanished on a spring morning in 1979, walking 2 blocks to catch a school bus in New York's SoHo neighborhood. His disappearance rewrote the rules of childhood safety and sparked a national movement. But when police finally arrested a suspect in 2012, the confession that promised answers only deepened the mystery. Some truths, it seems, remain buried even after they're spoken aloud. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of 113 Prince Street, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. SoHo in May 1979 hummed with the energy of transformation. Old industrial buildings breathing new life as artist lofts, cobblestone streets echoing with the footsteps of families who saw possibility in the neighborhood's gritty charm. Julie Patz moved through her kitchen with practiced efficiency, preparing breakfast while her 6-year-old son Etan bounced excitedly nearby. His future flight captain cap sat slightly askew on his dark hair, a gift that had become his most treasured possession. 2 blocks, Etan announced, spreading his arms wide as if measuring the distance. I can walk 2 blocks by myself. Stanley Patz looked up from organizing his camera equipment, studying his son's earnest face. As a professional photographer, Stanley understood the power of capturing moments, but this morning felt different, weighted with the significance of a small boy's growing independence. You remember the route? Julie asked, her voice carrying the careful balance every parent knows, encouraging courage while harboring protective instincts. Etan nodded solemnly. Left out the building, straight to West Broadway, wait for the bus. His confidence sparkled in, eyes that saw the world as an endless adventure. Outside, the neighborhood awakened. Shop owners unlocked their doors, commuters hurried past with coffee cups, and delivery trucks rumbled over cobblestones worn smooth by decades of city life. SoHo felt safe in 1979, a community where neighbors knew each other's children and watchful eyes tracked familiar faces. Stanley knelt beside his son, adjusting the boy's blue button-down shirt. Straight there, straight back on the bus. No detours. No detours, Etan repeated, his voice serious with the weight of responsibility. Julie kissed her son's forehead, breathing in the scent of soap and childhood that seemed to follow him everywhere. This was growing up, letting go in small, measured steps that felt enormous. At 7:50 a.m., Etan stepped onto Prince Street, his small figure disappearing into the morning flow of pedestrians. The neighborhood continued its rhythm, unaware that everything was about to change. The yellow school bus arrived at its designated stop near West Broadway. Children climbed aboard, backpacks bouncing, voices chattering about weekend plans. The driver checked his list, counted heads, and noted one absence, Etan Patz. Probably sick, he assumed, marking the boy absent before pulling away from the curb. Miles away at Etan's school, teachers took attendance. Another mark in another book, absent, unexplained. By mid-afternoon, concern rippled through the Patz apartment. The school had called. Etan never arrived, never boarded the bus, never walked through those familiar classroom doors where his teachers waited with math worksheets and story time. Julie's first instinct was denial, a mistake in the records, a mix-up with schedules. But as minutes stretched into an hour, then 2, the truth settled like cold stone in her chest. At 3 p.m., she called the police. My son didn't make it to school, she told the officer who answered. He left for the bus stop this morning and never came home. The responding detectives arrived with notebooks and routine questions. Children wander off. They get distracted, they follow friends or chase stray dogs, or simply lose track of time. The first hours of any missing child case carry more annoyance than alarm. But Julie Patz described a different child, responsible, focused, a boy who understood rules and followed them. As the sun set over Prince Street, painting the windows of 113 inches golden light, those initial assumptions crumbled. Etan's clothing became evidence. Blue button-down shirt, blue corduroy pants, blue sneakers, future flight captain cap. His route became a crime scene. 2 blocks of sidewalk where a small boy had simply vanished. Night fell over SoHo with unusual weight. Floodlights appeared on Prince Street as police officers began a systematic canvass of the neighborhood. Bloodhounds arrived, sniffing through trash cans and basement entrances, their handlers watching for any sign of recognition. Stanley Patz worked through the night, printing photographs of his son from negatives he'd shot just days before. Etan's face emerged in developing solution. Bright smile, curious eyes, the innocence that would soon become a national symbol. By dawn, missing child flyers papered lampposts and storefront windows. Neighbors who'd never spoken began coordinating search efforts. The grocery store owner, the cafe manager, the artist in the converted warehouse, all united by the terrible possibility that evil had touched their community. "Have you seen this boy?" became the question that echoed through SoHo's narrow streets. Witnesses came forward with fragments of memory. A woman thought she'd seen a child near a convenience store on West Broadway. A delivery driver remembered a small figure in blue walking alone. But as detectives compiled statements, contradictions emerged. Times didn't align, descriptions shifted. Memory, they learned, was fragile evidence. The bloodhounds lost Etan's scent within a single block. Whatever happened occurred quickly, leaving no trail for trained noses to follow. By the third day, Etan Patz's disappearance transcended neighborhood tragedy. Television crews arrived, their cameras capturing the growing memorial of flowers and photographs at the corner where he'd vanished. Reporters interviewed tearful neighbors and determined volunteers, each searching for answers that seemed to dissolve as quickly as they formed. The investigation expanded beyond SoHo's borders. Detectives checked hospitals, shelters, and bus stations throughout the city. They interviewed known offenders and followed tips that led to dead ends. Each promising lead crumbled under scrutiny. Julie and Stanley Patz faced the cameras with dignified desperation. Julie's voice remained steady as she described her son's personality, his love of airplanes, his careful attention to instructions, his excitement about growing up. Stanley's photographs provided the images that would burn into America's consciousness. "Someone knows something," Julie said, her words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Someone saw what happened to our son." But SoHo offered only silence. Weeks became months. The massive search effort slowly contracted, though it never entirely ended. Divers searched the Hudson River, construction crews checked building foundations, sanitation workers examined landfills. Each effort yielded nothing but the growing certainty that Etan Patz had vanished completely. The case files thickened with statements, photographs, and theories that led nowhere. Major crimes took over the investigation, assigning detectives who would carry Etan's case for decades. His file cabinet grew to occupy an entire wall. Summer arrived in SoHo. Life continued its rhythms around the absence. Children played in the same streets where Etan had walked, their parents watching with new anxiety. The neighborhood that had felt safe now carried an undercurrent of fear. The calendar turned to 1980, then 1981. The Patz family remained in their apartment on Prince Street, maintaining the same phone number in case their son somehow found a way to call. Hope and grief lived side by side in rooms that felt both full and empty. In 1983, President Reagan declared May 25 the anniversary of Etan's disappearance, National Missing Children's Day. His face appeared on milk cartons across America, part of a new awareness campaign that brought missing children into everyday consciousness. The simple act of eating breakfast became a reminder that somewhere, children were lost and families were searching. Etan's photograph, reproduced millions of times, carried a message that transcended his individual tragedy. Every child mattered, every disappearance demanded attention, every family deserved answers. Parents nationwide reconsidered their children's freedoms. The casual independence that had defined childhood in earlier generations gave way to careful supervision. Playgrounds emptied earlier. Walks to school became accompanied journeys. The stranger danger that previous generations had whispered about became a constant, visible concern. Julie Patz became an advocate, speaking at conferences and working with legislation designed to improve response times and coordination in missing child cases. She channeled grief into action, ensuring that other families might receive the immediate attention that could make the difference between recovery and loss. But Etan remained missing. The late 1980s brought a peculiar kind of suspended existence for the Patz family. SoHo gentrified around them, industrial buildings becoming expensive lofts, corner bodegas transforming into boutique shops. The neighborhood evolved while their apartment remained frozen in time. Etan's room untouched, his clothes still folded in dresser drawers. Stanley continued his photography work, though every assignment carried the weight of documented absence. Julie maintained her advocacy, attending meetings and speaking to law enforcement groups about the gaps in child protection protocols. They held vigils each May 25, gathering with neighbors and strangers who remembered a small boy they'd never met. Candles flickered against the growing darkness, and speeches honored not just Etan, but all the children who had vanished into America's shadows. The investigation never officially closed, but it gathered dust. Detectives retired, passing files to younger officers who inherited frustration along with evidence boxes. New leads grew rarer. Tips became desperate reaches from psychics and conspiracy theorists. The case that had captivated a nation slowly faded from headlines, remembered mainly on anniversaries and in the advocacy work that continued in Etan's name. In the early 1990s, a new name emerged from the case files: Jose Antonio Ramos, a convicted child molester with a disturbing history. Ramos had connections to the Patz family's former babysitters. More troubling, he'd made statements about knowing what happened to a boy in SoHo. Detectives found Ramos in a Pennsylvania prison, serving time for unrelated charges. He was intelligent, manipulative, and enjoyed the attention that came with being questioned about high-profile cases. His admissions were tantalizing and incomplete sketches of locations near Etan's route, hints about basement spaces, suggestions of knowledge he claimed to possess but couldn't quite recall. "I might have been around that area," Ramos would say, his words carefully chosen to suggest without confirming. "Things happened that I don't like to think about." He drew maps of SoHo streets, marking buildings where he claimed to have stayed. The geography matched Etan's disappearance, but physical evidence remained elusive. Ramos thrived in the gray spaces between confession and denial, offering just enough detail to maintain investigative interest, without providing the concrete proof that could lead to prosecution. Years of interviews yielded volumes of transcripts filled with evasions, contradictions, and tantalizing near admissions. Ramos became the investigation's white whale, always present, never captured. In 2004, the Patz family pursued civil litigation against Ramos, seeking some form of justice through a different legal avenue. The case proceeded by default judgment when Ramos failed to respond to the lawsuit. The court awarded the family $2 million, a symbolic victory that provided moral vindication but no practical closure. Ramos remained in prison on unrelated charges, effectively beyond the reach of financial penalty. The judgment existed on paper, a legal acknowledgement of probable culpability that couldn't restore what was lost or answer the questions that persisted. Media coverage of the civil case brought renewed attention to Etan's story. Television programs revisited the details of his disappearance, interviewing the aging detectives who'd carried his case and the parents who'd never stopped searching. Each anniversary brought documentaries and retrospective articles, keeping his memory alive in public consciousness. But answers remained as elusive as ever. In 2010, a new Manhattan District Attorney's Office took a fresh look at cold cases that had defined the city's criminal history. Advancing forensic technology offered possibilities that hadn't existed in 1979. Digital reconstruction could enhance old photographs. DNA analysis could find traces in evidence that previous generations of scientists couldn't detect. The Etan Patz case received renewed attention. Files were digitized, interviews were retranscribed, and leads that had grown cold were warmed by new investigative techniques. Detectives began focusing on specific locations along Etan's route, particularly buildings that had undergone construction or renovation in the months following his disappearance. Basement spaces became points of particular interest, private areas where evidence might have been concealed and forgotten. The investigation's new energy created ripples through SoHo. Longtime residents who'd lived with the mystery for 3 decades suddenly found detectives at their doors again, asking questions about memory and observation that reached back through years of accumulated experience. In April 2012, the basement at 127B Prince Street became the center of unprecedented excavation. Ground-penetrating radar had suggested anomalies in the concrete floor. Forensic teams descended into the space with jackhammers and precise measuring tools, searching for evidence that might finally answer the questions that had haunted a neighborhood and a nation. The building stood just yards from where Etan had vanished. Historical records showed that basement renovations had occurred shortly after his disappearance, timing that seemed too coincidental to ignore. Television crews gathered behind police barriers as investigators removed tons of concrete and soil. Each bucket that emerged carried the possibility of resolution. Each tool that struck concrete echoed with 33 years of accumulated hope. The excavation continued for days. Soil samples went to laboratories. Concrete fragments were examined under microscopes. The basement that had been private space became a public symbol of the search that had never ended. When the work concluded, The basement yielded only disappointment. No remains, no evidence, no answers to justify the massive effort and emotional investment. The crowds began to disperse, resignation settling over the investigators and media alike. Another dead end in a case that had produced nothing but dead ends. Then a phone rang in New Jersey. Pedro Hernandez had been living a quiet life as a store clerk when his brother-in-law called police. For years, family members had whispered about strange confessions. Pedro had made stories about a child in New York, about something terrible that happened in the late 1970s. The relative had grown tired of carrying the secret. On May 23, 2012, police arrested Pedro Hernandez at his home in Maple Shade, New Jersey. The soft-spoken man with graying hair and nervous mannerisms seemed an unlikely figure to resolve America's most famous missing child case. In the interview room, Hernandez spoke in measured sentences about a morning 33 years earlier. He'd been working at a convenience store on West Broadway when a small boy approached, asking for directions. Hernandez claimed he'd lured the child into the store's basement with an offer of a soft drink. "I choked him," Hernandez told detectives, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know why I did it. I choked him and he went limp." The confession continued with details about disposing of the body in trash bags, about the store's layout, about the guilt that had followed him for decades. Some details matched what investigators knew about Etan's disappearance. Others seemed impossible to verify. The arrest sent shockwaves through SoHo and beyond. Headlines screamed the news. Man claims he killed Etan Patz. Television programs interrupted regular programming to report the development. The confession that seemed to solve everything also raised troubling questions. Pedro Hernandez suffered from schizotypal personality disorder and had been diagnosed with low intellectual functioning. Mental health professionals who examined him questioned his ability to distinguish between reality and delusion. His statements were internally consistent but lacked physical corroboration. No witnesses had seen Etan enter the convenience store. No evidence connected Hernandez to the crime scene. His confession, detailed though it was, existed in isolation, words without proof. Defense attorneys argued that Hernandez was suggestible and prone to false memories. They pointed to his history of psychiatric treatment and his tendency toward religious visions. The man who confessed to killing Etan Patz might genuinely believe his own story while being completely innocent. Prosecutors faced an unusual challenge, building a case on confession alone. In an era of DNA evidence and forensic certainty, they had only the words of a mentally ill man who claimed to remember details from 3 decades earlier. The legal proceedings became a battle over the nature of truth itself. Could confession without corroboration constitute proof beyond reasonable doubt? Did mental illness invalidate admission, or did it explain the crime itself? The first trial began in 2015. 36 years after Etan Patz disappeared. The courtroom became a theater where memory, doubt, and justice performed their complex dance. Prosecutors played Hernandez's confession for jurors, his voice filling the courtroom with details about a crime that had haunted a generation. They brought witnesses who testified about the defendant's behavior in the years following Etan's disappearance, periods of depression, religious obsession, and strange admissions to family members. The defense presented a different narrative. Psychiatric experts testified about Hernandez's mental condition, his susceptibility to suggestion, and his history of false confessions about other crimes. They argued that a man who couldn't reliably distinguish between reality and imagination couldn't be trusted to accurately recount events from decades earlier. The jurors listened to weeks of testimony, examining evidence that existed mainly in human memory. They saw photographs of Etan as a bright 6-year-old and Pedro Hernandez as a troubled adult. They heard competing theories about guilt, innocence, and the reliability of confession. After days of deliberation, the jury remained deadlocked. 11 jurors voted to convict. 1 held out, convinced that doubt remained about Hernandez's guilt. The mistrial declaration felt like another failure in a case that had produced only failures. The system that promised justice had delivered only uncertainty. The retrial began in winter 2017, in the same courtroom where hope had died 2 years earlier. New jurors heard the same confession, examined the same evidence, and wrestled with the same questions about mental illness and criminal responsibility. This time, the defense took a different approach. Instead of denying Hernandez's presence in SoHo on the morning Etan disappeared, they acknowledged that he might have been there. But being present, they argued, didn't equal being guilty. Memory could be contaminated, guilt could be imagined, confession could be the product of decades of mental illness rather than actual criminal action. Prosecutors maintained their focus on the confession itself. They brought new psychiatric experts who argued that mental illness didn't automatically invalidate admission. They emphasized the specific details Hernandez had provided information that seemed to match what investigators knew about the case. The second jury deliberated longer than the first. They requested transcripts of the confession, photographs of the crime scene, and clarification about the legal standard for conviction based on uncorroborated confession. On February 14, 2017, they reached a unanimous verdict, guilty of second-degree murder and first-degree kidnapping. The courtroom erupted in mixed emotions. Julie and Stanley Patz wept silently, holding hands as they heard the words they'd waited 38 years to hear. Defense attorneys announced immediate plans to appeal. On April 18, 2017, Pedro Hernandez stood before a judge to receive his sentence. The courtroom was packed with reporters, advocates, and observers who'd followed the case through its decades of investigation and trial. "You took away his opportunity to grow up," the judge said, addressing the defendant who stood with his head bowed. "You took away his opportunity to live." The sentence was 25 years to life in prison. Hernandez offered a barely audible apology, his words lost in the formal proceedings that marked the end of his freedom. Outside the courthouse, Julie and Stanley Patz spoke to reporters with measured satisfaction. Justice had been served, they said, though it could never restore what was lost. Their son's case had created lasting changes in how America protects its children. That legacy, they suggested, mattered more than individual punishment. The conviction felt like closure, but it was incomplete closure. No body had been recovered, no physical evidence had been found. The case remained technically open in some fundamental way, resolved by legal proceedings but not by investigative fact. Supporters applauded as the Patz family walked into afternoon sunlight, their hands clasped together after nearly 4 decades of searching. The months following the conviction brought retrospective media coverage that examined the case's impact on American society. Documentary producers revisited the investigation's key moments. Journalists interviewed the detectives who'd carried the file through multiple decades and career changes. The conviction satisfied legal requirements, but questions persisted in the minds of observers who'd followed the case. Some mental health experts continued to question whether Pedro Hernandez possessed the cognitive capacity to commit the crime he'd confessed to. Others wondered whether a different suspect, perhaps Jose Antonio Ramos, might have been responsible for Etan's disappearance. The absence of physical evidence meant that conviction rested entirely on confession and circumstantial testimony. In an era when DNA analysis could identify suspects from microscopic traces, the Etan Patz case stood as an anomaly, a major conviction built on words rather than science. National child safety advocates pointed to the lasting changes that had emerged from Etan's disappearance. Missing children protocols were faster and more comprehensive than they'd been in 1979. Public awareness campaigns had educated generations of parents and children about personal safety. Federal legislation had created databases and coordination mechanisms that didn't exist when Etan vanished. His face remained a symbol of vulnerability and vigilance, a reminder that protection required constant attention. In late 2017, appellate court judges began reviewing the conviction that had seemed to end America's most famous missing child case. Defense attorneys argued that jury instructions had been flawed, that the trial judge had failed to adequately explain the legal standards for conviction based on uncorroborated confession. The appeals process moved with the measured pace that characterized all legal proceedings, but its implications were dramatic. If the conviction were overturned, Pedro Hernandez might be released or face a third trial. The closure that families and advocates had celebrated could dissolve back into uncertainty. Legal experts debated the strength of the appellate arguments. Some believed the conviction would survive review, arguing that the evidence, though unusual, met constitutional requirements for guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Others suggested that relying entirely on the confession of a mentally ill defendant created vulnerabilities that appellate courts might find unacceptable. The Patz family found themselves in familiar territory, waiting for a legal system to provide answers that might never come. Appellate judges announced their decision months later. The jury instructions had been clearly wrong, they ruled. The trial judge had failed to properly explain how jurors should evaluate uncorroborated confession from a mentally ill defendant. The conviction was vacated. A new trial was ordered. The news hit the Patz family and their supporters like a physical blow. Years of legal proceedings had culminated in a verdict that provided some measure of closure, only to have that verdict disappear on a technicality. Pedro Hernandez remained in prison pending the prosecutor's decision about whether to pursue a third trial. His mental health had deteriorated during incarceration, raising questions about his fitness for additional legal proceedings. Public reaction was mixed. Some observers saw the appellate decision as proof that the justice system worked correctly, protecting defendants' rights even in high-profile cases. Others viewed it as a failure of that same system to provide finality for victims' families who'd waited decades for resolution. The case that had seemed resolved was suddenly uncertain again. In the months following the appellate decision, uncertainty dominated discussions about the Etan Patz case. Prosecutors faced difficult choices about pursuing a third trial. The defendant's call on necessity, declining mental health created practical obstacles to additional proceedings. The public's appetite for continued litigation was unclear. Julie Patz continued lighting candles at her apartment window each evening, a ritual that had sustained her through decades of searching. The conviction that had briefly provided closure was gone, but the memory of her son remained vivid and uncompromised. The legal complexities that had overturned the conviction seemed remote from the emotional reality of loss that had defined her life since May 25, 1979. Courts could declare verdicts valid or invalid, but they couldn't restore childhood or explain evil or fill the absence that had shaped everything that followed. Stanley Patz maintained his photography work, though his most famous images remained those of his missing son. The pictures that had launched a national movement continued to represent hope, loss, and the possibility that vigilance might prevent other tragedies. Their apartment on Prince Street remained unchanged, a museum of memory in a neighborhood that had been transformed by time and economics. The legacy of Etan Patz extended far beyond individual legal proceedings. National Missing Children's Day continued to commemorate his disappearance, bringing attention to families still searching for answers. Federal databases tracked missing children with efficiency that hadn't existed in 1979. Amber Alerts could mobilize communities within minutes of a child's disappearance. School safety protocols required careful documentation of absences and immediate family contact when children failed to arrive. Parents received training about personal safety that previous generations had learned through intuition and fear. The changes represented a society's response to vulnerability, collective action motivated by individual tragedy. Etan's disappearance had revealed gaps in protection that seemed obvious in retrospect but had been invisible before his case exposed them. Child advocacy organizations invoked his name when seeking funding and legislative support. His photograph appeared in training materials for law enforcement and social services. The boy who had vanished without a trace became a permanent presence in America's approach to child protection. Educational programs taught children about personal safety without instilling paralyzing fear. Parents learned to balance independence with supervision. Communities developed networks of mutual support that could respond quickly when children were at risk. Evening light filtered through the windows of 113 Prince Street, casting familiar shadows across floors that had witnessed decades of grief and hope. Julie Patz moved through rooms that had been frozen in time since May 25, 1979, when a 6-year-old boy had left for school and never returned. The neighborhood around the apartment had changed completely. SoHo's industrial character had given way to expensive retail and luxury housing. The cobblestone streets where Etan had played now hosted fashion shoots and tourist groups. The community that had searched for him no longer existed except in memory, but his room remained untouched. His clothes still occupied dresser drawers. His favorite books sat on shelves where he'd left them. The apartment served as a monument to interrupted childhood, a space where time had stopped and hope had learned to survive without expectation. Pedro Hernandez remained in prison, his conviction overturned, but his freedom still restricted pending prosecutors' decisions about future proceedings. Jose Antonio Ramos had been released from unrelated charges and disappeared into obscurity. The case files continued to occupy their wall of cabinets, filled with decades of investigation that had produced legal resolution but not emotional closure. Stanley Patz arranged his camera equipment each morning, preparing for assignments that would take him into a city that had been transformed by his son's disappearance. The missing child protocols that had emerged from Etan's case now seemed routine, immediate alerts, coordinated searches, public awareness campaigns that mobilized communities within hours. His photographs of Etan remained the most reproduced images he'd ever created. They'd launched a national movement, changed federal legislation, and educated generations of parents and children about safety and vulnerability. The technical quality of those pictures mattered less than their emotional impact. A bright smile, curious eyes, the innocence that had made his disappearance feel like a national injury. The images captured not just a specific child, but childhood itself, the trust and openness that made protection necessary and precious. Professional photography had become a different career after Etan vanished. Every assignment carried the weight of documented memory. Every portrait suggested the fragility of the moment being preserved. The camera that had once captured commercial images now served as witness to time's passage and loss's permanence. Media coverage of the Etan Patz case continued to evolve with changing technology and social awareness. Documentary filmmakers produced retrospective examinations of the investigation, exploring how the case had altered American culture. Podcasters dissected the legal proceedings, analyzing the challenges of conviction based on uncorroborated confession. The story attracted new audiences who hadn't lived through the original disappearance but understood its historical significance. Social media platforms hosted discussions about child safety, criminal justice, and the reliability of confession. Online communities debated the evidence, the verdicts, and the appellate decisions. Each retelling emphasized different aspects of the narrative. Some focused on investigative failures and missed opportunities. Others celebrated the advocacy that had emerged from tragedy. Still others examined the legal complexities that had prevented definitive resolution. The case had become a cultural touchstone that transcended its specific details. It represented questions about safety, justice, memory, and truth that resonated with audiences who'd never heard of SoHo or West Broadway. The evening news continued to mark anniversaries of Etan's disappearance, though the coverage grew shorter and less prominent as years passed. May 25 remained National Missing Children's Day, but the connection to a specific case became historical rather than immediate. Children who had been born after his disappearance learned about the changes that had emerged from his case without understanding the fear and uncertainty that had motivated those changes. Amber Alerts seemed natural rather than revolutionary. Missing child protocols felt routine rather than desperately innovative. The normalization of safety measures represented success evidence that society had absorbed lessons and implemented improvements. But it also created distance from the emotional urgency that had driven reform. Jose Patz spoke at fewer conferences as she aged, though her advocacy work continued. She'd become a symbol of parental endurance, representing families who'd learned to live with unanswered questions. Her dignified persistence had helped transform grief into social change. Late at night, when SoHo streets emptied of tourists and shoppers, the neighborhood revealed traces of its earlier character. Streetlights illuminated cobblestones that had witnessed decades of history. Old buildings carried architectural details from industrial eras that preceded their artistic and commercial transformations. On Prince Street, the apartment where the Patz family had maintained their vigil glowed softly in surrounding darkness. The windows that had displayed missing child posters now reflected the gentle light of table lamps and reading chairs. The search for Etan Patz had become part of the neighborhood's mythology, a story that longtime residents shared with newcomers who wondered about the memorial plaques and historical markers. Tour guides mentioned the case when describing SoHo's evolution, from manufacturing to art to luxury retail. But the emotional weight of the disappearance had settled into the architecture itself. The streets where a small boy had vanished carried an indefinable sadness that persisted beneath their commercial vitality. Federal databases now tracked thousands of missing children with technological precision that hadn't existed when Etan disappeared. Instant communication could alert entire regions within minutes of a child's disappearance. Social media platforms could distribute photographs to millions of viewers in hours rather than days. The infrastructure of search and recovery had been revolutionized by his case and others like it. Professional coordinators managed volunteer efforts. Psychological counselors supported families during investigations. Legal advocates ensured that parents' rights were protected throughout proceedings. But technological advancement couldn't answer the fundamental questions that had defined the Etan Patz case. Confession without corroboration remained problematic evidence. Mental illness continued to complicate criminal responsibility. The passage of time still degraded memory and destroyed physical proof. Modern investigators possessed tools that their 1979 predecessors couldn't have imagined, but they still struggled with the human elements of crime, motivation, reliability, truth that resisted scientific analysis. The photograph on Jose Patz's mantle showed Etan at age 6, smiling with the confidence of a child who believed the world was fundamentally safe. His future flight captain cap sat at its familiar angle, and his eyes sparkled with curiosity about adventures that would never come. The image had been reproduced millions of times, appearing on milk cartons, missing child posters, television screens, and internet sites. It had launched a national movement and changed federal law. It had educated generations of parents and children about personal safety. But in the quiet of their Prince Street apartment, it was simply a picture of their son. The boy who had wanted to walk 2 blocks alone had become a symbol of every parent's deepest fear and most persistent hope. His disappearance had revealed the fragility of the protection that adults provided and the vigilance that safety required. The legal proceedings that had consumed decades of their lives, investigations, trials, convictions, appeals, had provided some measure of justice but no restoration of what was lost. Pedro Hernandez might spend his life in prison for confessing to Etan's murder, but the confession couldn't return the childhood that had been stolen. Justice in the Etan Patz case remained incomplete and uncertain. The conviction that had briefly provided closure existed in legal limbo, subject to appellate review and potential reversal. The confession that had seemed to solve America's most famous missing child case continued to raise questions about mental competence and criminal responsibility. But the changes that had emerged from his disappearance were permanent and profound. National Missing Children's Day honored his memory while protecting other families. Federal databases and communication systems could mobilize massive search efforts within hours. Educational programs taught children about safety without paralyzing them with fear. The transformation represented collective learning from individual tragedy, society's attempt to ensure that other families wouldn't endure the decades of uncertainty that had defined the Patz experience. The boy who had vanished without a trace had become a catalyst for institutional change that would outlast any legal verdict. The courtroom where Pedro Hernandez had been convicted stood empty most days, its judicial proceedings having moved on to other cases and other questions of guilt and innocence. But the legal precedent established by his case continued to influence how courts handled confessions from mentally ill defendants. Legal scholars debated the implications of conviction based solely on uncorroborated admission. Some argued that such verdicts protected society from dangerous individuals who might escape prosecution due to their mental conditions. Others contended that accepting questionable confessions undermined the constitutional principles that protected all defendants. The appellate decision that had overturned Hernandez's conviction created new requirements for jury instruction in similar cases. Trial judges would need to more carefully explain the standards for evaluating confession evidence, particularly when mental illness was involved. These legal developments extended far beyond the Etan Patz case, influencing how the justice system balanced protection of society with protection of individual rights. The 6-year-old boy's disappearance had reshaped not only child safety protocols but also fundamental aspects of criminal procedure. Investigative techniques had evolved dramatically since 1979, when detectives had relied primarily on witness statements and physical evidence that could be analyzed with limited technology. DNA profiling could now identify suspects from microscopic samples. Digital reconstruction could enhance decades-old photographs. Database searches could connect crimes across jurisdictions and time periods. Yet the Etan Patz case demonstrated the limitations of technological advancement. All the forensic sophistication in the world couldn't overcome the absence of physical evidence or the unreliability of human memory. The most advanced investigative tools remained powerless against crimes that left no scientific trace. Modern cold case units studied the Patz investigation as both inspiration and cautionary tale. It showed how persistence could eventually yield results, even after decades of failure. But it also revealed how those results might be incomplete, unsatisfying, and legally vulnerable. The detectives who had inherited the case from their predecessors understood that resolution didn't always equal closure. Justice might be served through legal proceedings, while emotional healing remained elusive. The families of other missing children often sought guidance from Julie and Stanley Patz, recognizing them as survivors who had navigated decades of uncertainty while maintaining hope and dignity. Their experience provided both instruction and warning evidence that families could endure the unendurable while showing the costs of such endurance. Support groups for parents of missing children frequently invited Julie to speak about advocacy, institutional change, and the careful balance between public engagement and private grief. Her presentations emphasized action over despair, suggesting that tragedy could motivate improvements that might prevent other losses. But she also spoke honestly about the limitations of closure and the persistence of sorrow. Legal verdicts might satisfy societal demands for resolution, but they couldn't restore interrupted childhoods or fill the emptiness that absence created. Her advocacy work had helped thousands of families navigate systems that were better prepared to respond to missing children than they had been in 1979. The changes she had helped implement represented her son's most lasting legacy. The basement at 127B Prince Street had been restored after the 2012 excavation, its concrete floor replaced and its walls repaired. The space showed no evidence of the massive investigation that had consumed weeks of police attention and public hope, but the building's history remained part of SoHo's collective memory. Longtime residents pointed it out to visitors, explaining how the search for Etan Patz had focused on that particular location. The empty basement had become a symbol of the investigation's frustrations, the massive efforts that had yielded no answers. Real estate listings for the building never mentioned its connection to the case, but neighborhood knowledge preserved the association. The space that had once seemed to promise resolution had returned to ordinary commercial use, though it carried the weight of extraordinary expectation. The excavation represented the investigation at its most hopeful moment, when advanced technology and renewed energy seemed capable of solving mysteries that had persisted for decades. Its failure demonstrated the limits of even the most sophisticated investigative techniques. Night settled over Prince Street with the gentle weight that characterized SoHo's quieter hours. The bustling commercial activity of daytime gave way to residential calm, streetlights illuminating cobblestones that had witnessed more than a century of urban evolution. In the apartment at number 113, Julie Patz prepared for sleep in rooms that had housed her grief and hope for more than 4 decades. The evening routine had become ritual: checking locks, turning off lights, pausing at the window that overlooked the street where her son had vanished. The neighborhood slept around the enduring mystery of Etan's disappearance. Children who lived in apartments that hadn't existed in 1979 dreamed peacefully, protected by safety measures that their parents understood but took for granted. The search for one small boy had changed how America protected all its children. That transformation represented victory of a kind, though it could never compensate for the individual loss that had motivated it. The streetlights continued their patient vigil, illuminating empty sidewalks where the echo of small footsteps would never fade from memory. Time had proven both healer and destroyer in the Etan Patz case. It had enabled the legal proceedings that eventually produced a conviction, but it had also degraded the evidence that might have made that conviction unassailable. It had allowed wounds to form scar tissue while ensuring that complete healing remained impossible. The decades that had passed since May 25, 1979, had seen tremendous advances in child protection, criminal investigation, and public awareness. But they had also demonstrated the persistence of evil and the limitations of justice. Pedro Hernandez remained in prison, his fate subject to legal proceedings that might continue for years. Jose Antonio Ramos had disappeared into obscurity, his role in the case forever unclear. The truth about what happened to Etan Patz existed somewhere in the space between confession and proof, memory and fabrication. Yet the boy's legacy lived in every Amber Alert that mobilized communities to search for missing children. It survived in every school safety protocol that ensured rapid response to unexplained absences. It continued in every parent who taught children about personal safety while preserving their sense of wonder about the world. The search for Etan Patz had become eternal not because he was never found, but because finding him had revealed how much protection required vigilance, how much safety demanded sacrifice, and how much love could endure in the face of inexplicable loss. His face would continue to watch from photographs that had become historical documents, reminding future generations that some absences change everything and some searches never end. The morning sun would rise again over Prince Street, just as it had on May 25, 1979, when a 6-year-old boy had stepped onto the sidewalk for the last time. The light would reveal a neighborhood transformed by time and economics, but it would also illuminate the enduring mystery that had shaped American childhood for more than 4 decades. Somewhere in the intersection of memory and hope, justice and uncertainty, Etan Patz remained 6 years old, forever bright, curious, and trusting in a world that had failed to protect him, but had learned from that failure to better protect others. The case that had captivated a nation would continue to evolve through appeals courts and legal precedent, but its most important verdict had already been rendered in the lives it had changed and the children it had helped save. In the quiet of early morning, before the city fully awakened, the absence on Prince Street felt both profound and purposeful, a reminder that some losses become catalysts for the protection of everyone who comes after. The search for Etan Patz had taught America that vigilance was the price of innocence, that hope could survive decades of disappointment, and that justice sometimes existed in the changes it inspired rather than the verdicts it delivered. His story would continue to resonate because it touched the deepest fears and highest aspirations of a society determined to protect its most vulnerable members. On Prince Street, where cobblestones held the memory of small footsteps, the search continued in every parent's watchful eye, every child's safety lesson, and every community's commitment to never let another family endure what the Patzes had survived. Time had not healed all wounds, but it had transformed tragedy into purpose and loss into lasting protection. The boy who had wanted to walk 2 blocks alone had given America the wisdom to ensure that other children could walk safely home.